I'm really pleased to be joined on Not the Andrew Marr Show by Craig Murray, who has been busy this week and watching lots of events unfurling at a rapid pace. How are you doing, Craig?
Well, okay. I'm like everyone. I'm kind of slightly exhausted and exhilarated at the same time by the speed of events. But these are good times, I think.
Well, on Monday we went to the High Court to find out if Julian Assange would be allowed to appeal because the US had given some sort of assurances that his extradition would not jeopardize his rights in some way. We were outside the court. When I got there, it was said that this was going to go on all day. It was going to be two sittings or something, and it would end in the afternoon. But then suddenly at about 12:30, someone came out and made an announcement.
He's got a leave to appeal. He's got the result. I'll talk him. You want to tell us what's happening? It's a bit loud here, though. Shall we go?
Guys, listen. Shut it down. I've just come from inside the court. Julian has won his right to an appeal against the extradition.
Now then, after that, people saying, "Oh yeah, but it's just they're trying to fob us off. This is just another trick from them." And so lots of people don't really know whether we're just being optimistic for the sake of wanting anything to be hopeful about, or whether there are grounds for optimism. What's your view on this?
On the negative side of that equation, Julian's still in jail and remains in jail, and will be in jail until probably the autumn at least, when they'll actually get down to the formal hearing of the appeal, and then probably a month or two after that, waiting for the final decision. So if you want to take the sort of cynical view, and there's a lot of reason to do that given the history, then this is all a way of keeping Julian in jail and putting the whole thing off until after the American presidential election, because it could become a further embarrassment for Biden if Julian arrives in chains in Washington before the American presidential election. But I don't think that's entirely what it is. I think the attitude of the establishment has changed. I think the support of his own Australian government now for Julian, not as firm or strong as we might like it to be, but the fact he does have that support from his own government changes the atmosphere a bit. I think the extreme weakening of Biden's political position with Biden's support for the genocide in Gaza changes the atmosphere a bit. All this changes the atmospherics in which the court is operating, and the, if you like, the osmosis by which members of the establishment know what they're supposed to do. On top of which, I do think Judge Victoria Sharp and Judge Johnson are better than any judges we've had before in the case. They appear genuinely to listen, to pay attention, to take notes, and to listen as attentively and pay as much attention to the defense arguments as they do to the prosecution arguments. And after following this for years and years and years and spending days and days in court, I would never have said that about any of the other judges in this case. And you do occasionally, within the establishment, meet decent people. And I say that as someone who was a member of the establishment for quite a few years myself.
Right.
And I think we may just have met some. I think that's a real possibility. There was one moment when the prosecution, the American government, who are the prosecution, acting on behalf of the American government, objected to the defense being given so much time to talk. And Judge Sharp overruled their objection and said, given what is at stake in this case, I will hear everything they wish to say. Right. And that, given what is at stake in this case, was really the first time in the entire 5 years of legal trials on the extradition that I've heard a judge acknowledge that there are huge issues here about freedom of speech, freedom of journalism, the right of the public to know about the right to reveal war crimes, or the government's right to cover up war crimes. That was really the first time a judge has acknowledged that this is not just a standard extradition of some criminal. There is a lot at stake here. And that to me was a key difference. So no, I am actually on the optimistic side. I think the tide has turned, and I do think we'll win this appeal, and I think Julian will be out by Christmas.
Wow. I mean, what is the appeal? I mean, I'm a bit confused about it's sort of these appeals and appeals to have an appeal. It's getting a little bit confusing here.
It's been confusing for quite some time. I mean, it's an amazingly tortuous process where Julian first won against extradition, then the Americans appealed against that decision, which the Americans won, and then there was to be an extradition, and then Julian appealed against that and lost, and then Julian appealed for the right to appeal against having lost, and has now won the right to appeal. So, if you're confused, you are entitled to be confused. But now it comes down, the appeal is only allowed on the point of whether or not he would suffer discrimination by nationality on grounds of not being allowed to plead the First Amendment because he's not an American citizen. That's the sole point of the appeal. That's all that will be heard in the appeal. Everything else has fallen. And again, if being a glass half full kind of person, I think this is very probably a way that the establishment have given themselves an off-ramp where they can manage to find against the extradition on effectively a technicality without saying we're not extraditing him because he revealed American war crimes, without saying we're not extraditing him because the Americans plotted to kill him or kidnap him, without saying we're not extraditing him because the Americans spied on his lawyers and stole all his legal papers. It's a kind of a less confrontational way of stopping it. Let me put, and my feeling is that they've not as a deliberate matter of policy and strategy, but they've fumbled their way through to that way out of it in a rather typically British establishment compromising kind of way.
We were outside the court waiting on what's going on there, and then we got this message on our phones about the ICC making an application for arrest warrants for Netanyahu and the war minister in Israel. So can we just backtrack a little bit? But before we talk about this, I asked you about the ICJ before, and you said they had more credibility than the ICC, and you said the ICC were almost patsies to the US and the established world order, I suppose. Now, this doesn't seem to be going along with what your narrative was. So, were you shocked by what came out from the ICC?
I was pleasantly surprised. I would say. I mean, the ICC, I think, have been forced to act because, what is happening in Gaza, the genocide in Gaza, is plain to the entire world. And every single day, the majority of people in the world are seeing horrible images from Gaza and seeing the war crimes that are being committed there continually. So the ICC was going to lose absolutely all credibility if it didn't act. Yeah. If the case wasn't happening at the ICJ, I don't think the ICC would have acted. I think that's part of what has pressed them to do it. But Obviously, I'm delighted. Netanyahu should have been charged by the ICC 10 years ago. This is long overdue, but it's a happy day that it's come at last.
I mean, just to sort of talk a bit more about the ICJ. This is an article from the Times of Israel in 2021. UK's Karim Khan, elected next ICC prosecutor, will replace controversial Bensouda. Said to be Israel's preferred candidate, British lawyer will likely decide whether to move ahead, etc. So what we see from that is the Times of Israel were saying he was a preferred candidate. What's your knowledge of him, and do you think he's proved himself in a good way in what he's done here?
I mean, I've never had a high opinion of him. We're not responsible for our families, but his brother was a Tory MP, and he, I think, has held off action against Israel as long as he possibly could. And, for example, whipped out an arrest warrant against Putin extremely quickly, been unable to do the same thing against Netanyahu. They haven't put investigators into Gaza. They have investigators all over the Ukraine. Bensouda, who he replaced, we should remember, had family threatened with assassination by people almost certainly acting on behalf of Israel and the United States, and went through a terrible time. And the idea was, I think, to get in. He was put in there because the West thought, Karim Khan, the West thought he would be more compliant. There's no doubt that's why he was put in there. And I think he has been more compliant. And I think he's doing this because he's forced to. But we will see. We will see how the case is pursued. The ICC had already asked the question and asked an expert working group to decide whether they had jurisdiction over things happening in Palestine, since Palestine acceded to the Rome Treaty, and it already has been decided by them they do have jurisdiction. So the nonsense spoken by the United States and the United Kingdom on that subject will soon fall through, and then we have to see how effectively.
Sorry, can you go back on that? What was how has that been proved against the US and UK about the jurisdiction? Who's spoken on that? Which body said that?
The ICC itself. When Palestine acceded to the convention, the ICC decided to take advice on, because it was being disputed, on whether or not it had jurisdiction in Palestine. Given, among other things, the fact that although the majority of countries in the world had recognized Palestine as a national state, they hadn't formally been recognized by the UN Security Council. Various other procedural issues. So the ICC set up an expert working group to recommend the court on whether they had jurisdiction. And this is about 8 years ago. The expert working group recommended that the ICC does have jurisdiction, and the ICC adopted that. And the ICC have said 8 years ago also that they have jurisdiction. And under the Statute of Rome, the ICC defined its own jurisdiction. So there's no one can do anything about that. And the United States and the United Kingdom are just whistling in the dark by denying jurisdiction.
And what do you make of? I mean, if you're on social media, I mean, the response from Israeli politicians and US senators and US politicians has been unbelievable. The rage at this ICC verdict and the kind of threats to Karim Khan and calling him an anti-Semite, and Netanyahu's totally lost the plot. I mean, this is a big thing, isn't it? I mean, it must be for them to be so outraged by it on social media.
Well, the problem is that their own institutions of international law that were set up by the Western powers and arguably always had a Western bias are staffed by people who believe in international law. And you can't find a genuine, serious, non-partisan international lawyer who doesn't think that extremely serious war crimes are taking place in Gaza, there are a small minority who genuinely think it doesn't reach the bar of genocide, but that's a very small minority. But everybody agrees that Israel's committing very serious war crimes in Gaza. So, either the ICJ and ICC have to dissolve themselves, or they have to to do what their job is. And the fury in the corridors of power in Washington, in London, in Berlin, that these kind of tools of their international policy that they set up are calling them out, really, on the genocide and on their support for genocide, is very strong. There's this huge dissonance where Western politicians, the Western political class, abandoned the precepts of Western liberal political thought, which had governed most of the period after the Second World War, and had moved into something much more authoritarian, utterly illiberal. And then they've been called out on it by the liberal institutions they created. And this sets up a huge dissonance, because they weren't being called out of it by the media, because the same people control the media who control the political class. And so the only, if you like, apart from dissidents like ourselves, the only clashes against this media, apart from the people, against this dominant narrative, are these liberal institutions which still exist. And now I think the answer is going to be extreme attack upon the liberal institutions, and that's what we're starting to see.
What are the chances of Netanyahu and the defense minister being actually arrested? And how does that actually happen? Is that something the government has to do, or can a citizen do that arrest?
Well, a citizen's arrest is extremely hard to effect. It's a kind of legal concept that exists in theory, but it relates more to, if you have a burglar in your home and manage to restrain them without too much violence, then your restraining them is not necessarily a crime, as long as it's done without too much violence. The idea that you can just walk up to somebody in the street and say, "I arrest you," and then they're arrested is not sadly really true in real life.
Oh, okay.
The chances are that, it would be extremely difficult for the UK not to arrest Netanyahu were he here, for example, because we are a party to the Rome Convention of the International Criminal Court. The government could argue he has diplomatic immunity, and extend diplomatic immunity to him specifically during his visit, but that would be a very strange thing to do. That would be very peculiar. And for example, diplomatic immunity wasn't applied to Pinochet. He was not extradited on health grounds, allegedly, in the end. So it's definitely going to restrict Netanyahu's travel. That's definitely going to happen. I think he's very unlikely to ever come to the UK again. But then he doesn't much anyway. I can't recall when he was last in the UK. It doesn't restrict his travel to the United States, because, of course, the United States isn't a party to the Rome Convention, but it definitely will restrict their travel in much of the world.
Right. I mean, if he stopped off on the way to the United States, could someone get him at an airport there?
Yeah, I mean, he could. What I'd love to see, you may recall that when Edward Snowden was escaping, the Americans believed he was on a South American presidential jet, and the Americans forced that jet down in Austria, I think. But Snowden wasn't actually on it at all. And of course, overflying airspace anywhere with an air force, their air force could force him down and arrest him, and that would be a delicious irony. I'd love to see that, but sadly, I think it's unlikely that the warrant will be effective. I think it makes it very unlikely, really, but he's going to move outside Israel and the United States in the future. But it's more important, bluntly, in making it much more difficult still for the media to maintain their narrative that the Israelis are doing anything wrong. These ICC judgment, the latest ICJ judgment as well, we've had this establishment narrative the entire time, but this is self-defense. And it's not genocide. And yet you've got the international courts now coming in, kicking in slowly. It takes time, but coming in with judgment after judgment, making plain and action after action, I should say, making plain that what Israel is doing is deeply suspect, to say the very least, in international law. It may take a little while to prove it's actually genocide, but that will eventually be proven. And so this just makes it far, far harder to maintain the media narrative and maintain Western support for Israel. So these are important. That's much more important than the practical chances of actually arresting Netanyahu. But his freedom of movement will be restricted. He's not going to be able to go on holiday to Spain or to or to move freely around Europe. He's not going to be able to go and talk to the European Union. He can't call on his friend von der Leyen. It's going to restrict his freedom of movement substantially.